I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this gathering is being broadcasted from the traditional lands of First Nations peoples, the owner of Treaty 6, which are also homelands to the Métis people. We honor the history and culture of all people who first lived and gathered on these lands. So we'll have a few housekeeping notes before we start today. If we could ask that you please have your microphone on mute during our presentation. And if you have questions, we have, feel free to put the questions in the chat, and we have people that will be monitoring the chat, and we'll answer all of those at the end of the session. And we will be recording the session also, and the recording will be on our Indigenous Ways of Knowing website on Portage College. So as we get started, I am Carrie Froller. I'm one of the vice presidents here at Portage, and my portfolio is People and Culture. It's with immense pleasure that we bring you this series both virtually and in person from the Wanska Room here at the college. This Wanska Room was built from the Ways of Knowing Cultural Spaces initiative at the college. And our college was established in 1968 and serves learners in northeastern Alberta. Our college began from a sit-in that was held by First Nations and Métis people, which truly demonstrates resilience and resiliency. And we're so grateful for that. And we're so thankful because now we have a beautiful college. We're also happy to be sharing the broadcast virtually, but also we have a small audience in here today, and we've got them live as well. So they'll be having questions, and we'll be answering their questions as well as the questions on the chat. So it's fun to be in both places at once. Before we delve into our program today, I'd like to invite an elder to come and say a prayer before we start our Indigenous series. And I'd like to invite Bertha DeWolf to the podium. If you would come and say a prayer for us, please. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be asked to do this prayer. So I will pray in my native language. Tawino si manto ginanas kumtinan tatagi sa ginanas kumtin kaginoy miak uma hotaski kia gatabitaman kiaski gatabitaman na sayo agi pinantamangin no nanda tugi sa gawa kami tama kues kabamu miumuhtia Kahkio kamiu itihtuya, kamamiu peskuatuya. Mina tatuki sa gawgyapit natutamadnan. Kamiu matsiyak, kamiu muktiyak. Hai, manas kaman.
Thank you, Bertha. Bertha is from Wabasca, Alberta, and is a second year student in our Native Art and Culture program here at Portage College. She is a fluent Cree speaker, attends cultural ceremonies, and teaches the tradition of brain tan smoked hide tanning as the smoke hide tanning way of the Cree people. Bertha loves learning about traditional crafts and is an avid beater and moccasin maker. And we really want to thank you today for sharing your prayer with us. And I do have a gift for you here that we'd like to present to you as well as appreciation for doing this for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'd also like to extend a heartfelt gratitude to our supporters, Pembina Pipeline Corporation and CN. Their generous support has made it possible for us to offer this speaker series to everyone free of charge, enabling us to share these valuable insights without barriers. So I would also like to extend a warm welcome to my co-host, Linda Bernicki. She is representing the Rural Development Network, and Linda will take a moment and share with us what the Rural Development Network role is and their collaborative efforts with rural and Indigenous communities across Canada. Linda, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Carrie. So like Carrie said, my name is Linda, and I'm the Director of Community Development and Indigenous Engagement with the Rural Development Network. But who are we? So a little bit about us. The Rural Development Network is a national nonprofit organization. We focus on sustainability and creating tangible community impact. We understand that rural communities have unique needs, challenges, and opportunities. And I'm sure you would all agree that many programs and services out there are focused around urban centers and delivering them in urban centers. And they often can't be delivered in the same way in rural areas because of the different realities of the social and economic structures and infrastructure that exists, or too often doesn't exist in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. The main things we do overall at RDN is we create innovative tools and resources, including guides, toolkits, and trainings that are created in partnership with community and are specifically designed for the unique needs of those communities. We provide expertise and boost capacity of communities in implementing their own projects in response to what their needs are. We do advocacy and help connect people in the sector to share resources and information through events and networks and learning opportunities such as a speaker series. And we support groups in accessing funding. We're happy to put our email in the chat. So if you would like to reach out and get more information about who the Rural Development Network is, we encourage you to do that. And now I'll just pass things back over to Carrie.
Okay, thank you, Linda. So at this time, I'd like to invite Lawrence Riel from Pembina Pipeline Corporation to join us and share a few words, and then he will be introducing our speaker. So Lawrence, if you're online, love to have you join us.
Right, I am online. I want to make sure you can hear me.
We certainly can. Welcome.
Awesome. No technical issues. Fantastic.
You gotta love it.
Thanks so much, Carrie. And as mentioned, my name is Lawrence Riel. I'm the manager of the Indigenous Engagement Team located in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Been with Pembina since 2018. Pembina Pipeline is a proud sponsor of this event. And I'd like to talk a little bit about Pembina. We are a leading energy, transportation, and midstream service provider that has served North America's energy industry, celebrating 70 years next year in 2024, owning an integrated network of hydrocarbon liquids and natural gas pipelines, gas gathering and processing facilities, oil and natural gas liquids infrastructure and logistics services, and export terminals business. Through our integrated value chain, we seek to provide safe and reliable energy solutions that connect producers and consumers across the world, support a more sustainable future, and benefit our customers, investors, employees, and communities at large. Pembina has grown from a single pipeline company in Alberta with 31 people into one of the largest midstream companies with approximately 2,600 employees and contractors. Over $9 billion invested in Canadian projects over the past 10 years, with an enterprise value of $40 billion as of March of this year, and a capital investment program of over $1 billion. Pembina has developed long-term relationships with over 25,000 landowners, 200 communities, and 120 Indigenous communities. Very important to Pembina is the safety and integrity of our operating systems and facilities as one of our key business drivers. We have quietly become one of the top pipeline companies in North America because Pembina keeps the products in the pipe. Pembina is Canada's third largest pipeline midstream company, headquartered in Calgary, Canada, with assets in Canada and the US. We are also the largest third-party gas processor serving the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. Our large-scale field processing asset base is complemented by strategically located mainline extraction plants. But enough about Pembina. More importantly, we are honored to have Derrick Houle from Smoke Signal Communications here with us today. Derrick is from Saddle Lake, Alberta, where he served as the Director of Emergency Management during the COVID-19 pandemic. Based on his pandemic experience, he has faced a true urgency within First Nations communities for communications. As a father and business owner, he has dealt with the limitations existing with all nations when it comes to training, accessibility, and opportunity. It is his desire to change that with SSCI as a unique provider of internet services to all First Nations communities who are interested in sovereignty and self-determination. Derrick completed his Native Studies degree and Bachelor of Commerce from the University of Alberta and works continuously to advance First Nations within the business world and for economic access. Today, Derrick will speak about resiliency and economy, how the cyclical exclusion of First Nations and rural communities are similar due to geography and purpose. Both are necessary for the greater population to be fed, cared for, and for economic development. Unfortunately, Canada does not recognize the complex structures, policies, and historical institutions that are in place to prevent economic prosperity for all Canadians. Derrick would like to go beyond the historical blame, guilt, shame, and create a real possibility for a future for the next 150 years through economic structures and tools that are available to all people in a first world economy. Please join me in welcoming Derrick.
Hello, everybody. My name is Derrick Houle. As Lawrence has just indicated, and I'm happy and proud to be here with you today. I was actually thinking about what I was going to be talking about for this last, since I was asked to do this. And one of the things that I forgot about that is I already had this outline. He just reminded me of what I was supposed to be talking about, because I had all these things that I wanted to share, and I realized I only have 45 minutes to share that with you, which is well over 500 years of history. And it's not going to be possible to share all of that here today. However, it's going to be, it's one of those things that just by having the communication and the conversation with you today, that I hope that you're able to see and for yourself research the different areas of economy that are currently in place, the tools, the procedures, the policies, and the mindsets that I'm going to be talking about today, so that you can take that on for yourself and see for your own organizations and the organizations that you deal with, whether or not everything is being as transparent as it can be. And the reason why I'm saying this is because most organizations today don't understand where they came from when it comes to the relationship with policy in Canada, procedure in Canada, legislation in Canada. And what I'd like to do is start from a very simple story of this fella named Gomez Ians de Azurara. Now, this fella, the reason why he's important is because he used to be, well, he was a chronicler of Henry he was a Portuguese king, and what his job was, it was to write down the story of this king's magnificent triumphs. And so in one case, in 1450, he wrote this story about Henry the I can't remember what his title was, but his claim to fame was that when Gomez had written the story, he said specifically that it was okay for him to kill, murder, take over another, it was a fortress at the time, because the people there had a darker skin than the king. So it was the first justification for something written down that identified skin color as being important for the reason why an action was acceptable. Shortly after that, the popes of the time, and I don't know exactly how many popes, because that's not my background is to study popes, but the papal bulls became relevant then, because the papal bulls right after that started to say things directly related to taking all resources from any colonized or conquered or un-Christian land, and that was going to be acceptable and purposeful in trying to grab all the resources from those lands with the intent of making sure that the papacy and that whole structure was the one to benefit from it. So, and when you read them, they actually are pretty specific on what they were going to do. Now, after that, those papal bulls became the theological bedrock for religious institutions all over the world, because they were able to insert themselves into legislation based on the transmission of Christianity and whatever religious tools or structures that people believed in at the time. They embedded all that stuff into legislations throughout that time frame to now. And one of the things is that if everyone is aware that last year when the Pope did come to Canada, he was asked to rescind the papal bulls, and that hasn't come about yet. However, just the connection from then to now and seeing how influential they were, and they still are, we don't look at how they've impacted all legislations in Canada, across any colonized country, and any First Nations community, whether it's North America or Africa or European. They've all been impacted by that mindset. And it just started with a story. And so we're looking at what story does your economy actually tell you? And most people won't be aware of it, because we don't look at it from, oh, okay, well, what's informing my development, my decision making, and whatnot. So 473 years ago, somebody told a story, and everyone just grabbed onto it, and they've all world economies use it. And so now when we're looking at First Nations people in today's age, one of the things that is often missed out when it comes to economy is agency. So with the Indian Act, when it came in, it was definitely based on the papal bulls and all the Christianity of the time, and what was acceptable and what was desired as a part of those specific instructions laid out, and how that document has changed over time. One of the things that hasn't changed about it is agency. And agency becomes important because most people don't realize that any First Nations community based on the Indian Act, if they're still under the Indian Act, all people who govern First Nations money basically have to follow that as an understanding of their agreement with the Crown. So there used to be Indian agents, and what the transmission of agency from the Indian agent became to was put onto the chief and councils. So every chief and council then, and this is very simplified, so I'm sure there's going to be people in an uproar like, no, it doesn't exist that way. But the simple version of it is that Indian Act monies, anything that's given out under the Indian Act, has an agency that has to follow the procedures and the rules of that organization. So in order for you to get any sort of monies from the government of Canada under the Indian Act system, you have to agree to manage, promote, report on that money based on the criteria given out from the well, now it's called ISC, Indigenous Services Canada, which used to be INAC, which is another acronym. But what comes out of that is that it limits all the activities in the First Nations community, because one of the things that those agreements say is that in order to get any money from them, you have to get the buy-in from the community leadership. You have to get a letter if you want to do anything economically developed in economic development. you have to get sign-in from the community, and that sign-in typically comes from the chief and council. And the chief and council, in turn, has to follow the rules that have been set out in their agreements to accept the money as dictated by the Indian Act requirements. So it becomes really difficult to get out of that system when everything is related to that system and defined by that system, and really it becomes a resource driven agreement. So when we're looking at how First Nations communities get communications and how that relates to the outside communities, what the issue becomes is First Nations people today are not aware of all the resources that are taken out of their nation based on the current systems that exist, because they weren't considered to be human beings at the time of the current legislations being drafted, which govern telecommunications resources. And Treaty 6 was actually signed in order to get the wire of oh geez, now I'm going blank, but the telegraph into the West. So that was the main purpose. It wasn't just the railroad, but Treaty 6 specifically, the intent of getting it signed was to keep the First Nations people from impeding the communication method going across Canada. So, and it wasn't Canada at the time, it was a territory. So what we're left with is that although at that time when Treaty 6 was signed, they had an understanding of how important telecommunications was, it hasn't come into play for First Nations communities and the surrounding communities, because any surrounding community, it falls into the same economic zone as the First Nations community. So as soon as you take away the resource ability of the First Nations community, any community around it is just as effective, because given the current systems, the current methods and procedures that are existing under specific legislations that were developed prior to 1982, First Nations people didn't exist. They weren't considered. And today, I would argue, most of those legislations still have the same purpose, which is to take resources from First Nations people, and as a result, it impacts the neighboring communities. So not to pick out any specific legislation, because you can actually look at just about every legislation in Canada to date, and if they were created prior to 1982, then you'll see that there is no verbiage specific to First Nations people. So when we're talking about even the easement of communities, one of the tools that the Canadian government still uses is easement. It's for the benefit of the entire population of Canada. And oftentimes that benefit of the entire population of Canada takes away from a specific group in Canada, which is not supposed to be that way. So one of the things that I deal with, especially after the pandemic, is I was in the position of trying to find out how we can get communications for children to be able to do their schoolwork. I looked at the different things that were available to me, and they were extremely well, they're very costly and they're very expensive, and they were all temporary. And then once I started to dive into that area, and my position was over, I was still affected by the fact that First Nations people didn't have access to basic communications, and that affected how emergency services went out. It affected how the RCMP would attend any emergency on the reserve. So they had to build a procedure that guaranteed them safety as best as they could, for them to be able to enter the reserve without communications, to be able to go into any situation and then come out safely. Now that really shows to me that the operations and the health and safety of First Nations communities is still at risk when it comes to communications, because now we have many organizations that have been given lots of money in Canada to provide communications and resources, and it still is based on that construct of resource reaping is the best way to say it, and that those agreements, the new programs, and everything else is still based on the Indian Act mentality, which is based on the Papal Bulls, which is we need to take as much from the communities as we can in order for this to be justified, to meet our current criteria. And most people won't see that because they didn't know about Gomez. And I just like that. I like that it's not known, that it's imperceptible, because when a First Nations child is born, they're born into this system. They don't know that all these constructs are above them. However, we do know that, and my personal experience of it is that those constructs limit not only business, economic development, but a development as a human being, because we only get so much access to resources, and some would say you get more access than a normal person. That may be true in some cases, and in some cases it isn't, because not every community is next to an urban center. Not every community is next to the same level of resources that everyone else has access to. So it looks like we're on a scale. And one of the things that I talk about is the 150-year plan. So it took since Treaty 6 was signed, 147 years approximately. It took that amount of time to get to where we are in our current situation. And that's with a lot of changes and a lot of positive changes in the last 20 years. However, in order to get to a point where our economies and our people are actually healthy, to be able to say that we've recovered and that we're resilient to the effects of the impacts on our economy, that is going to take a number of years. And my estimate is that within 150 years, we might come to the point where our numbers actually recovered from, the different programs that the government put in place with the sterilization of men and women. And that's still active. And that's amazing that after all this time, that it's not within the last 5 years, there's still doctors being, taken to court, and people are still trying to stop them from the forceful sterilization of Native men and women. And then when we go forward, and that's not to say that there's any blame, I'm just saying that's a fact, right? So it's not to say that people should take this on as, oh, this is really a depressing conversation, because this is a conversation that is existing, whether it's depressing or not. It's just, there's so many facts and so many impacts and so many processes and desires from individuals and corporations and organizations that they all have an impact on First Nations communities. And it's going to take a number of years to get to the point where there's some balance in the communities, where the First Nations leaders have actually healed enough to be able to see the constraints that are put on them. And then the communities are healed enough to be able to teach children that these are the constraints and that we can actually see a way around them. And then for the structures and organizations that are outside the communities to be able to see their purposeful impact on those communities, not by any fault of their own, because every individual comes up with their own belief systems and their own developmental challenges. So once we get to the place where we can identify the traumas, and we know about residential schools and we know about the impacts of that. And I actually did go to a school myself, that once we get to the point where we can actually say, okay, well, that wasn't my fault. That was just what was. And I know that the people that administered that place, they thought they were doing good because that's what they were taught. And so now when we see it, okay, so what we're looking at, what equality and resiliency could actually mean in an economy, it will take ensuring that the story, whatever that story is told, and that our economic reality matches the best, healthiest picture that we can develop, and that there's actual action to make sure that that comes to fruition. And that over the time frame, that is going to take a long time. And if it doesn't take that long, then fantastic. But my estimation, based on the last 500 years and all the things that have gone into it, that it's going to take a significant amount of time for us to get to a point where we're actually covered as human beings, and that we're covered as people with the same opportunities. And one of the things that we are going to have to answer to and create is chattel for First Nations communities, because right now under the current system, nobody can own anything. So First Nations can't own infrastructure. The Crown owns that. And so anything that's put onto a community, especially when it comes to telecommunication, that goes into the abyss of the Indian Act system. So the community can't use it as chattel, can't use it as equity, can't use it as anything of value to develop their community more. They can only go based off of service contracts and whatever they can actually do outside of that. So there is no value to any of the infrastructure, like the utilities, any of the power poles, any of that. It's understood. So, and that's the Indian Act portion of it. But what that also does is that it limits First Nations growth, because when you don't have the same tools to be able to develop your economy, you have to find another way of doing it. So in my experience, it's been that we have to bring 100% of the cash for whatever project we want to do. We bring that to the bank and we go through the government systems to be able to say whether or not we are actually going to be able to do the project. And then we have to get sign-offs from XYZ. And it's just a really monstrous process. Because one of the things that most people don't realize is that once you have too many people on the paper to get a loan, that it becomes too risky, and the project is often deemed it's not feasible, because the amount of players attached to any one project it doesn't work under our current financial systems. So what I've been looking at is different tools that are available for First Nations people that have been available for generations. And a lot of those tools are the financial tools that we don't have access to currently, because First Nations people, because they weren't considered to have value until 1982, 83, we didn't have access to the basics, such as insurance. And insurance for First Nations communities is a big thing, because we can't get our houses insured for the structures under the system because they don't exist. We can only get insurance for contents, and depending on the insurance company, most insurance companies won't even touch the contents of a First Nations home as long as it's on a First Nations home, or sorry, First Nations reserve, because they have no chattel associated with it. So it becomes a cycle of missing. And so when we have all these gaps in the economy, how do we close those? And that's the joy of my experience to date, is that I've been going through trying to figure out how do we create infrastructure for First Nations communities to be able to have education, have businesses, have the basic level of connectivity that is considered our future economy that becomes available to us. And there's so many structures in place that prevent that. And it's not intentional. We're still under the paper bowls, that idea, and looking at what we can do from there, and going how far we can create these structures to be different without, creating the blame and the shame and all these other things. That doesn't work for any progress. We do have to just look at what exactly is happening and how we're actually going to solve it. And so when we're looking at First Nations communities, we do need government agencies to look at their structure from a specific lens. Typically, the way the legislations are going, they have to measure liability, their risk, their tolerance, what it's intended to do. And typically anything that's written specific to First Nations always has a negative impact. And because it's still under that lens of how do we take resources. To date, I haven't seen anything that's been created where we actually have reversed the chattel. We've reversed the impact to development and inclusion. And although there are some monies being earmarked for First Nations economic development, it's still under the Indian Act system. So it can only go so far. It cannot be for infrastructure. And whatever the process is that those specific monies are earmarked for, it's never enough. So when most of the money is capped at, say, for any specific program, and I'm just guessing here because I haven't gone through all the programs, just the ones that I've dealt with, the cap is 100,000. So in order for a First Nations community to get that type of money, then you have to go into getting the First Nations, whichever First Nations you belong to, or whatever the community is, to sign off on it that they're going to take that risk with that organization. So it becomes very difficult, and it's not something that you have to do off reserve. So one of the things that I'm clear on is that in order for us to get past all of this, the human being part of this has to be considered. The structures that have been created have to be reviewed. The actions that are going to be taken in order to undo all the previous history is going to have to be specific and is going to have to take into account every lens of those specific individuals who are creating that, no different than wanting, not necessarily getting, but wanting the Canadian judiciary as a whole, wanting them to be as healthy as possible, to be able to see wherever they're coming from when they pass judgment on all First Nations people. And that's one of those things that impacts our legislations, because if it's not just, it shouldn't be. However, we still have a lot of unjust structures, laws, procedures, regulations in place. So this has been my experience, because I've had to work through all these systems to try to get to the point where my company can actually make a significant impact. And I'm always basically looking for the loophole in the pay-able mindset. In every legislation, in every organization, every government structure that I deal with, I first run up like a wall against that. Doesn't matter which organization it is. I come up to the limitation, and then I have to see a way around it. And this is going to be not unique to me, because this is most entrepreneurs, whether they're First Nations or not, we come up against whatever the limitation is. And we want to make sure that we get beyond it. And that's why we're entrepreneurs, is because we don't like structure necessarily, especially when it's put upon us. And so we are always looking for the way around. How do we still do what we want to do, even though there's something that we're having to deal with? And one of those things is financial literacy is not something that First Nations and Canada as a whole is willing to take on. First Nations don't, it's not that First Nations don't want to take it on. It's just that because of the pedagogy of education in Canada, it's required that we have to leave it out of the curriculum. We cannot teach children about fairness in economic systems. We can't teach them about being able to do their own banking. We can't teach them about how we can actually describe what a bank is in the literature at whatever the age is. We can describe that that's the institution you want to be able to do business with. What we don't tell them is that institution doesn't give returns. They use your money. The system is designed for their improvement. So just mentioning a bank in any education system gives them a marketing edge that puts people into a certain category of wealth. And then once you get out of that, and you're outside of the education systems, outside of the pedagogy, and you're able to see what the financial tools that are actually available to all human beings, you have more of an opportunity to create wealth for individuals. Now, individual wealth is something that's been looked down upon for generations in communities. Because, you know, as small groups coming from bands into tribes, individual wealth didn't exist. It wasn't part of our epistemology, our way of knowing who we believed ourselves to be. However, in order to undo all the century of really bad things, we're going to have to look at how we create economic wealth for individuals so that we can have intergenerational transfer of wealth rather than intergenerational poverty, which is the current system that we live under. We have to create intergenerational wealth so that we have a baseline of systems that support First Nations communities, and by extension, the communities that are tied to those First Nations communities which live off of them. One example is that my home reserve, Saddle Lake, is attached to 3 separate counties. So every county gets their piece of the money that is earmarked for Saddle Lake because they provide services. And then when those services are given out, the nation doesn't receive that same set of money because they've already given it out to all the 3 counties. And so when something like a fire happens and you have a fire on the north side, which is in the northwest side, which is in Smoky Lake County, on the northeast side, which is in St. Paul County, and then you have a fire on the south side, which is Two Hills County. Each fire has a cost associated with it, especially since you only have 1 fire crew in the nation and you have 3 fires. So 2 of those fires are going to get charged to you. And that's part of the system which has been designed, which is really impactful. And one of those things is that we don't look at what the economic recovery would be, or what the gain of creating a system which overcomes that would be. So these are the types of things that I run into every day, and they all have a cost. And we don't talk about what the financial impact is. We don't teach people, our communities, because depending on where the community is located, they're either going to be attached to 1 county or 2 counties. And the money that's supposed to be going to that First Nations community goes to Child Family Services for the province, goes, especially with the current judiciary. You know, it's been said, and I'm just only saying what I've seen to date, it's been said that the new residential school is the Child Family Services programs that exist in Canada, because they take them out of the home and they put them away from their home. They take them away from the family and they put them into whatever, you know, their new family would be. And a lot of that has such a traumatic impact that we don't need to focus on financial tools or any of the other healing tools, but we just focus on creating the trauma economy. And one of this is the trauma economy is something that I've been working on for a while, and it's all the negative impacts from all the legislations and all the ways of being and the ideas that are out in the world that take away from any one individual as a whole. And that's where we start as an individual, because that's where I started. All the impacts of everything that happened in my life came from legislations, came from education, came from all these things that are considered to be a civilized society, but we don't look at how do we heal all those traumatic impacts. And so currently, when we're looking at the idea of self-help is $1 billion industry, but we don't look at it from the First Nations perspective, is that $1 billion industry isn't designed to take and change all those legislations. It only focuses on the end result of all the legislations, all the pedagogies that are out there, and that's what we create our communities with. And so when we're looking at it, it'll take some time for this conversation, even just to get into another person's experience, to be able to look at what's going on around them. Where's the trauma economy impacts, and how does that impact everything else? So these are the things that I've been working on in order to make sure that when I go into a community, that I first speak to the trauma that's actually existing. Then I look at what the limiting factors are. And then I look at how we can actually overcome those in a way which is transformative, which creates possibilities for the community, so they don't have to be stuck in the Indian Act methodology. And by extension, the ideas that were created by Gomez, the Ains the Azurara. So those are the things that I deal with, and I just wanted to, definitely take this opportunity to share with you that we do have tools available to us to overcome this, and they come simply by identifying what our lens is. How do we see these things? Do we actually follow the government's tools that are existing right now that came from the papal bulls? And if they do, then how do we undo them? And that's going to take the entire population of Canada, because legislation, in order to affect what's been going on, is going to take knowledge and experience and challenging what the current overall thought processes of this country are. Because one thing that is still very clear is that when we have a treaty, we're not in treaty with Canada. We're in treaty with the Crown. So right now, we're in treaty with the future king. And once that future king comes into play, that's who we have to start negotiating with again. Because until then, the tools that have been created under the Crown through the Indian Act will stay in place until this pinnacle of civilized society in the Western Hemisphere says, okay, enough's enough. Because it is going on his name. His mother lived with it in her experience for all her life, and the king before her, and Victoria. So we have all these lineages of monarchs that have held on to this idea of monarchy. We're still in that monarchy because we have treaties, and being able to have that conversation and say, okay, enough's enough. Then we have a path forward, but it's going to take time. It may not be under this king. Like, this king may not last long enough to be able to affect any change, but the people who come after him, hopefully they've learned enough from our current existence to be able to say that, enough's enough. So that I want to be clear that if we only focus on blame and the anger and the frustration of the whole system, we won't get to the answer of it. We will just be focused on reliving the trauma, being in the fight and flight experience of just having that in our face. We actually have to deal with ourselves, get ourselves to the point where we can actually have a healthy interaction with all of this stuff, and then systematically bring it down one at a time. And that's going to take some time. When we do that, we have opportunity with changing those rules, changing those structures, and then going to redeveloping recreating, maybe just creating what a healthy First Nations community can actually look like prior to any treaties being signed. And with that, I'll take questions.
Thank you so much, Derrick, for the insight that you've given us and giving us a new lens to look through and a different perspective, especially on legislations and government programs and things like that. It's really helped us in seeing that there is an imbalance and what can we do to help get that balance back for your community. So really appreciate that. So we're going to open it up, and if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. We will monitor that. And I'll ask our room here if there's anyone that has any questions here. We'll take questions from the room or from the chat. And now's your chance to get the perspective from Derrick. We also like to welcome everyone. I understand we have over 140 participants today in our speaker series, and just taking a look in the chat, we've got international and national. So someone's from Czechoslovakia, we have from Newfoundland, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. So this is just amazing, and we thank you very much for participating in this.
There's 44 people.
Good. And I'm not sure if Linda or Lawrence, if you have any questions we have a hand up here. Deanne, if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question, please do.
Thank you. And Derrick, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. I always learn so much from you, and always a pleasure to hear what you have to say. So you described many things that need to change if we're to achieve recovery and healthy balance in Indigenous communities. So is there a role that you can see the RDN play that would help support making some of these changes? Or looking at it another way, are there things the RDN could do to support Indigenous communities in an appropriate way?
One of the things is that the communication between rural communities and First Nations communities has been fractured at best. And we haven't had a healthy dialogue or a place to have a healthy dialogue. And so if Rural Development Network was able to create a process or an environment where anyone could come and have a conversation and have a mediated conversation in some ways. Because just in my experience, when I've talked to different leaders about what's going on in the community, they have zero contact with the county or the next town or whatever it is. And for that to get to the point where we actually have a dialogue and we talk about what's actually happening for us, nobody else will know. And so if we're only suffering in silence and in solitude, then it doesn't do us any good. And so one of the things that the Rural Development Network could do is create a platform to invite First Nations leaders and county leaders to come and just have a conversation and to see what we could actually do. Because I know that the government, although they do say that they're on board and they're interested in all these other things, they have limitations. And they can't take that risk. The government as an organization is a risk-adverse organization. They don't want to be caught creating healthy or unhealthy they've created unhealthy for generations and decades and, all over the world. But one of the things is that they don't want to do is get caught doing something good and not work and then be blamed for it. So an organization like the World Development Network would be able to create something that did work and doesn't have to be big.
Thanks, Derrick.
And I think, Derrick, what you said is so powerful, because it's about starting the conversation, and somebody has to start the conversation. And it's interesting to hear you speak, because when I hear you speak, your message is the same, but the way that you say it is different. And so I learned so much today, even though I've spent some time beforehand talking with you and learning about you and what you would talk about. I heard something different. And so it's just really interesting of how you would be able to put that together. And the conversation is well overdue, right? It's 2023. So why aren't we having these conversations? So we have a question from Lisa, and her question is, in our day-to-day work, what steps can we take to support breaking down the systematic barriers that you talked about, especially if we don't work directly in government or don't have direct influence on the systems?
That's the beautiful part of it. I don't work in government and I don't have direct influence on the systems either. So by having conversations, by getting into the conversation and being able to have, being able to look at yourself and see how the organizations that you do business with operate, being able to look at what the history says about, the way the economic industry is supposed to work, and then seeing whether or not in your interactions are you in that without seeing. And most people are, and this is to go without saying, that most people have an imperceptible experience of the paper bulls. They don't, one of the common things is when this comes up is that I wasn't alive when these things were done, so I'm not responsible. That's a common thing that I hear. I didn't do that to you. I did. And looking at it and say, okay, so what am I allowing to continue to exist? Can I talk to my what do you call them, my MLA, my MP? Can I have that conversation? By law, they're supposed to allow you to talk.
Today you didn't have to walk with her. No. Yes.
Kids. So that's one of those things, is learning your current legislation system that you have the most impact in, having a conversation with your MP, your whatever the leadership that you participate with, whether it's a union, whether it's a charity, whether it's a nonprofit, just having that conversation. There really is no boundary on having a conversation with any leader in Canada. If you find an email address and you just have a conversation, and that develops, some wheels turning somewhere in a different way, then that can create an impact. And I'm not saying stalk anybody or be abusive or any of that. I'm just saying once you're able to have the conversation with yourself and then have it with one other person, that will create a change.
Thanks so much, Derrick. You've talked about some really deep, complex things, but you talked about them because the systems that have been made complex, and that's why we're only just having conversations now, right? And so I really appreciate part of what you said too is that, oh, well, I wasn't around when that happened, so it's not my fault. And I'm just wondering if you have any recommendations or suggestions, because sometimes these conversations are very difficult. People aren't really sure what to say, or if they're scared they might say something offensive. And some people are just disrespectful about the situation in general. So I'm wondering if you have any guidance of words of wisdom. So when we are having the difficult conversations and we're getting, that was my grandparents' fault, not my fault, like that kind of stuff. If you have any thoughts around that.
Oh, one of the first thing that I always think of is that every human being on this planet has trauma. And every human being was developed in a certain method. Like there were certain impacts that either happened or didn't happen in any person's life, and being able to see whoever you're talking to as just a human being with all of that. And that creates the connection to be able to say, okay, I hear you. I hear that you weren't alive. And I hear that this happened before you. But what's happening right now in your experience? And bring it back to the individual, because it's so easy to be able to dissociate yourself. And this is one of the things that we do. We go into fight and flight, and we shut down, and we're like, oh, no, this conversation's making me feel uncomfortable. And being able to be with uncomfortable and to give whatever empathy as a human being can have with another, will create the connection to be able to have a conversation. And it's not always going to be fun. It's not always going to be safe. You have to measure the audience to be able to determine whether or not you should actually be even talking about it. I don't want anyone to get harmed by taking this on, because there's been enough harm already.
If there, as we just finish up with the questions, Derrick, is there, because you did talk about so much stuff, if you could say, I wish all of you could walk away with this one thing today, or something along that line, what would it be that you would really want each of us to walk away with today from listening to you?
Oh, it would be the ability to look at what you're dealing with and how all the historical impacts that you don't see are actually there. And it'll be in your wording. It'll be in your ideas. It'll be in your mission statements. It'll be in everything about the organization that you're participating with. And how does that reinforce or work to change the things that I talked about, especially when it comes to the papal bulls? Is that what you're doing? Are you still on the papal bull version of what it is to have economic development? Or are any other side other than that? And what does that look like? So on top of being able to see what your participation is in it, what is your organization? Because that's how we make our identities. Is, well, still to this day, if somebody comes up and asks me, I say, well, I'm an entrepreneur. I don't belong to any specific organization, but most people will say, I belong to this union, or I belong to this, or I belong to this. Then that's your identity. But does your identity support it or not?
Thanks so much. And I'll just pass it back to Carrie to see if there's any last minute comments or questions in the room that you're in.
Feel free, anybody. I don't see any hands going up, so I'm not sure. They're madly taking notes and really thinking about the conversation. Derrick, you've given us so much to think about, and thank you for allowing us to get the conversation started for the uncomfortable conversation. So that's really important to have that in our toolkit as we go and start talking to people. The other thing that resonated with me is how to, when you talk about the negative, how things were written with the negative lens, how to reverse that for the inclusion. And that's really important, I think, for us and as a college to take that forward too. How do we work with that? So thank you so much for that insight. So we we really appreciate you, both Derrick and Elder Bertha, for joining us today. And for everyone online that joined us for our first speaker series. So now we are going to announce that we have our next speaker coming up next Tuesday, actually, at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And she is going to be Lori Thompson. She's an Indigenous education leader from the her home community is the Kikino Métis settlement. And she'll be presenting on Métis Net teachings on the topic of resiliency. And Lori will actually be in person here in the Wanska room chatting about that. And if any of you happen to be in the Lac La Biche area, please join us in person because we will be hosting Stu and Bannock. So we'd love to have you join us. And of course, if you're online, it would be great to have more people join us as well. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to Lawrence and Linda as well for helping out today and helping us to embark on this journey of resilience, knowledge, and unity throughout the month of September in our series. So thank you again, and we hope to see you next week. Have a good day, everyone.